Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this this session. To introduce the people here, they will give a jolly wave when I say their name. But Andy Mead from Firefly Solar, Chris Johnson from Shambhala, Bill Egan from Aggreko, Rob Scully from Croissant Neuf. I think the thing to try and get out of this morning is where power's come from and where it's going to, because there's a perception of from where I sit. I edit a magazine called Access All Areas, and I touch on the green and the powering of festivals quite a lot. And there is a closed shop perception about it. I think that there's a ring around, but power's just a done deal that happens, and you know, you charge a set amount and you deliver a set thing, and the numbers are never really divulged or dealt with. And I just wonder whether that's a fair comment, or how much there is sort of negotiation and digging down. I don't know if we could just take that along the line, what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's the reason it appears a closed shop is it's absolutely critical to operating almost any event, and it's immediately and violently noticeable when it's not there. So almost any promoter has been bitten at some point by the embarrassment of a dark, empty stage and a lot of shouting people throwing things. So therefore, the closeness is about finding people you trust to do it, to deliver it. And that's the primary driver over and above probably anything else. Second driver is then cost, so then be bickering about cost. And if there's, you know, a handful of people, companies that promoters have used and are happy could do it, then, you know, you get a bit of competitive bickering as well. But those are probably the two significant drivers, and it really is it's fear. It's that, because without it, it's strange magic, and without it, your event just stops and you're in a whole world of unpleasantness. Yeah. So that's, I think, what drives it more than any other force.
Are the days of long contracts in this gone? Because I guess if you're contracted for 5 years, you can, how you deliver it, doesn't need to be, you don't need to get into that much conversation about it. As long as you deliver it 1 year, you can deliver it the same way the next year.
It depends how same the thing is. I think it's the other way around. I think what's happening is a consolidation, and it's partly to do with the consolidation of you know, festivals into bigger organising groups, as the economics drives it, that they therefore want to tie in those sort of deals in the same way you do the site and you know, in other infrastructure stuff. And I think there's more tendency to do that, provided you're happy you found someone who'll do it for you.
Andy, from your perspective, I mean, you're coming at this from a clean green perspective. From the beginning.
Yeah, I think what Bill says is true for the larger scale events. You know, they tend to work with the same supplier year on year. There's a pick of a handful of organisations that are big enough to deal with this kind of scale of events that Bill and his team generally work on. But I think the smaller scale, the independent festivals, are a bit more open-minded to alternatives, maybe more fluid and changing year by year in the way that they present the festival and the scale of the festival. So I think, you know, our experience is that working with smaller events is easier. Those that are building their power plan from scratch, and as we'll come on to later, there are scalability issues with renewables that mean that it's more accessible on a meaningful scale for organisers of smaller events than it is for larger scale organisers.
And Chris, your Shambhala, your festival is completely green from top to bottom, isn't it? You don't. All the power there is.
We have managed 99% renewables, which is majority waste vegetable oil, biodiesel, and solar and wind. We didn't actually manage that last year, I have to be honest. But in terms of this debate and the closed shop, we have done, as the Powerful Thinking campaign, 18 months worth of exploration into the relationships, the issues and the opportunities, basically how we power our industry. And what we found, and I think this is what we're touching on here, is that the relationship between festival organiser and power contractor is archaic, in the sense that festival organisers and even experienced production managers, it seems, have got a genuine lack of awareness about how power works. So bogs and fences, you know how many, you know where they're going to go, but power is inherently complicated. And like you were saying, Bill, the way business has been done for a couple of decades now is a festival organiser gives a contractor what is usually a rough idea of power requirements, there's an inherent risk on the hand of the contractor to deliver a reliable power because the information they get is relatively sketchy. The contractor has to overcompensate, put more capacity in to make sure the show runs. So what we end up with is an unnecessary kind of level of fuel consumption. And I think what needs to happen is that festival organisers need to look in a bit more detail, and maybe with guidance from their power contractors, at what they actually need, and then a more intelligent system using smaller generator sets, less generators by combining loads, and less fuel, and we can get to that situation quite easily, I feel.
But you do increase your risk then, don't you? Because the closer you cut it and the less provision you have, anything goes wrong and you're kind of...
I think that's a red herring, because what you're doing is you're understanding your requirements much, much better. So you're still building in redundancy, you're still building in contingency, but you've got an awareness of what you actually need.
Right. Rob?
Well, yeah, I'd agree with all of those points actually, but I mean, Bill's one is pertinent. Is I think the relationship at the moment with power providers is based mainly on fear. Yeah, the show must go on, and the main thing that the promoter is frightened of is that it stops because they've run out of power for some reason, and so there's a sort of built-in inertia to changing anything that you've done before because it might make it go wrong. So what coming to what Chris said, what you've got to do is enable the event organisers to have the right information in the first place, and the more information they have, the more confident they can be that they can change things without things going wrong.
How are they going to get that information? What's the answer to...
Well, I mean, Chris said you can enter into discussions with your power provider and try and get your power provider to do it, but then the power provider, like Bill said, is taking on some of the risk then, and there's you want to see some reward for that as the supplier. You can't take on all of the risk and not expect to take any of the profit out of it.
This is where...
But on the other side, one of the things that I think should happen personally, is just my own view, is that we should have some kind of outreach to these people, to the organisers, where we can provide relatively cheaply somehow, don't ask me how exactly at the moment, advice, so you can get people who are reasonably experienced who can go to other people's events and say, look, I don't want to interfere with your professional relationship with your power provider. All I want to do is to help you to understand your power requirements, get you information. You own that information, not me, not the power provider, and then you can make informed decisions about it. But at the moment, that lots of the festivals don't have that in-house expertise. It needs someone else really to go in there and help them with that, I think. That's just my own view.
And it's because of this that 2 years ago we formed the Powerful Thinking campaign in recognition and feedback from festival organisers that they actually wanted to be more energy aware. And this is where I have to plug the power behind festivals, a guide to sustainable power at outdoor events, which is on the Julie's Bicycle and the Agrina Festival on the AIF website. And that gives as much information as we currently have collectively on how festival organisers can run their festivals more sustainably. And one of the key sort of headlines which came out of that piece of research is that we're quite confident that almost all festivals could save 10% on their fuel bill by reading the guide and employing some of the ideas in it.
Yeah. It's such a shop window, the festival thing. Everyone's watching you, so there's pros and cons to that. You've got to deliver, and if anything goes wrong, you get the headlines for all the wrong reasons. But then if you do something different, that's flagged up, isn't it? To say, God, they made this work with this. So then that message goes across very quickly. So,
it depends how clear that message is.
Yeah.
The number of punters who can tell you the difference between a big LED fitting and a VL5 with a kilowatt bulb in it is probably small. There's lots of earnest professionals
Getting
going,
larger.
oh, that's good. But it's quite hard to get, it's a different one maybe where you have things like festoon bulbs, light bulbs versus CFLs or LEDs. People can see them and relate it more easily. But it is a bit of the hidden world. The power fixes just make it happen.
how long do you think it's going to be before there's a really sort of discernible change in the big scale festivals and how they deliver them? I mean, are we looking 20 years or? Is it going to be faster than that before you could say that something the nature of Glastonbury, Reading and Leeds have, gone across there and are powering it sustainably?
That'd be depends what you mean sustainably. I think the first part of that is reduction in fuel. And when it's cheaper to implement practices that save fuel than it is to burn the fuel, I think that's where the tipping point is over the next 20 years. Will be mostly dictated by fuel price, which I guess is going up about 14%. You'll know a lot better than me how close you are to that point. But I think that'll be the driver from a fuel efficiency point of view, unless the organisers come in earlier and say, we will only renew your contract if you start addressing the renewables issue, and we expect you to deliver a proportion of the event with renewable technologies, at which point there's a different driver. It's a win the contract or don't win the contract, and that is the power that the festival organisers have, and at present I don't think used to the best of their ability.
Is there a role for legislation in that?
The legislation isn't helping either fuel efficiency or the use of biofuels from what I can see from a technological point of view, and I don't think that's going to get any better over the next 10 years.
I think it comes bottom of the chain of legislative drivers, which are much more focused on things like health and safety.
Yeah.
I think it's more about intervention, I think, and information rather than legislation. How many bonds can I have? But yeah, I don't think legislation is a good driver for it.
I think what's exciting about having this conversation now is if we were having it 3 years ago, with my festival organiser hat on, we were struggling to find cost-effective, renewable, low-carbon, reliable solutions. Well, technology's caught up with us, and there's now a handful of professional companies which are offering low-carbon solutions, which are reliable and are becoming increasingly cost-effective. And on the issue of adoption, we're beyond starting the journey now as an industry. It's becoming quite normal that at least a small percentage of festivals' power is renewable. So Reading and Leeds are already using biofuel. British Summertime at Hyde Park is looking at a commitment to 15% solar power. There's a whole handful of festivals that have been doing it for a decade or more, such as Andes, which is somewhat of a pioneer. And so this isn't a new idea, and we're already on the journey. And what my interest is, particularly looking at efficiency. So there's two debates for me. There's our environmental impact, lowering carbon as an industry, and a commitment to that. But there's also viability of festivals themselves and the cost. And the two sort of strands of approach that really come strongly through the guide are, we can look at efficiency and we can look at low carbon solutions. And it's the same conversation, and it's two different conversations, but they're both as important.
The efficiency is what comes first, in my opinion. I mean, we run a festival, and Crossing There Summer Party runs it entirely on solar power. But we can only do that because we've reduced our power requirement to a very efficient, low level. And if you introduce efficiencies first, the first thing you do is you save fuel. Then you might save generator sets, you don't need so many sets. And then the next thing you do is certain parts of that have come down, the power requirement for certain areas on your site has come down to a level where you can employ renewables entirely to run those areas. And we do it for an entire festival. It's only a small festival, it's only like 3,000 or 4,000 people.
Right.
But we do the same at Glastonbury. We run a stage at Glastonbury, which has all this. If you go and watch a band on our stage at Glastonbury, it says you're having the same experience as if it was run on a diesel generator. It's the same. The sound is excellent, the lighting is good, but it's run off solar.
It can be the driver for efficiency can be the demand for low carbon technologies, because if you say we are going to run this stage on solar power, and all of the contractors that are delivering contracts for that stage need to be aware of that, they will have to specify their equipment accordingly. So rather than saying, you spec your power, you spec your sound and lighting equipment, then tell us how much power you need, and we'll provide it with a bit of extra just in case, then what we say is, we're providing a solar power stage, we have this much power to work with, go and design a rig that works within the limitation of that system. And from a lighting and sound point of view, there's been a huge revolution in energy efficiency over the last 5 years.
The PA sound, the sound you get out of a system that's run from a solar rig is actually better. There's less hiss, there's less interference than there is from a main system.
So
and the lighting.
you can maintain those production values by using high efficiency lighting and sound equipment, but sometimes the driver is the other way around. So, you know, if you set the limitation for this is what we're going to do, spec your kit accordingly, then people will do that. If you say we'd really like you to cut down on your lighting a little bit, and we're not going to give you any more money to do it, then it's not going to happen. You're still going to have a venue full of old par cans, as long as you won't give them a bit more money to be more efficient. Unless the driver is already there, you haven't got a choice. You know?
There is another key. There's one very simple little thing that drives quite a lot of this, which is that we all use a standardised range of sockets. We all use C-form sockets or power locks pretty much, and they come in a set of standard sizes: 16, 32, 63, 125 and 400 amp. And that's the plug you're going to have on pieces of kit.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask people what they want, they say, oh, I want a 63 amp supply, please. 5-pin 63 amp C-form. You go, okay, fine. If 10 people ask for that, you go, okay, no, I want 600 amps of power. Well, I'm not putting anything less than 500 kVA on that, because, you know, blimey, if that all pulls that, it's going to be a nightmare.
Comes back down to
Now, the reality may be that each of these is, you know, the number of times I've run vast cables around things to find a guy who plugs an adapter in the end and puts a tiny little box on the end.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating.
These are the huge inefficiencies that we can quite easily weed out by collecting more information at the pre-production stage, so that we know not just do they want a 63.3, but what are they actually plugging into it?
Bill came up with a really good
And
analogy.
collecting that information,
Last
you
event.
can easily then see whether or not the generator set that you're putting in is correctly sized, or indeed you could do it on renewables, and your options are there when you have the information.
Yeah, Bill was talking at another event that we did a similar panel at about the Olympics and the media centre at the Olympics. You have a desk for each media person where they report from, and they do all their work, and it has a 13 amp or two 13 amp sockets, but they specify it as a 13 amp supply. We want a 13 amp supply. But now on the specification sheet, that means they want 13 amps of power continuously. But what they actually do is plug a laptop into it, which goes nowhere near 13 amps of power.
Not many of them bring their own kettles, no.
No. So if you plugged an electric kettle into it and had it boiling constantly, yes, you'd be drawing 13 amps all the time. But not many people are going to do that.
And then we get into the complexities of, do you have to ring up every single person who wants to plug something in and get them to write down the list of everything that they want to plug in, and how does that work when you've got an event where there's hundreds of thousands of people? It becomes impractical at a point, and that's why the power guide, to some degree, says that working with renewable providers can work best when you give them an autonomous area where they run autonomously, they run their own stage, they know what's being plugged into their sockets because they're bringing the stuff that gets plugged in, and that way they can spec efficiently, and there's no extra layer of pre-production and coordination between different parties. So that's one way. If this sounds like, oh god, this sounds like it could get complicated and we're going to have to do a load more work, there are shortcut routes, like just outsourcing it to someone like Croissant-Nurse, someone like Firefly. There's a list of such suppliers in the Power Thinking Guide that will come and run an area with the power and lights and tech production. So that's a really easy move for organisers who don't, if you're not ready yet to start saying, okay, we're going to start from the ground up collecting information, so everyone can get involved on one level or another.
Sidestepping all of that, how green was the Olympics? Because the sustainable message that came out of it was huge, and it was the big drum that was banged, but in terms of power provision, how green was it?
There's some very big figures around that.
I've got a badge for that, so I ought to be nice. This is where we get to two issues around it. Something like that, because it's always going to be difficult, and the difficulty comes back to the fear factor. Everything is backed up 3 times, so there's massive redundancy in the system, and that will never be inefficient. And that redundancy is there. So there's 2 issues. If you say, was it the right size generator, but you had 3 of them and you only needed 1? That I doubt you're going to ever get away with, because of the desire to have a backup for the backup of a lot of stuff, and a requirement. People like the sport. Remember this? It's driven by it's requirement driven. Very few Olympic committees would have the bottle to say to the various federations and stuff, no, you can't have it. and they wouldn't get the money because the money comes, follow the money. So, we did a lot. The other side, is do you reduce that impact? Now, there's particularly with generators, which is subject probably more things. If we're looking at diesels, there's essentially two aspects to the sustainability element of them. One is carbon, and that's just simply down to the amount of fuel you burn. Simple as that. It's a straight line from the amount of fuel you burn. So that's about how you use it efficiently. On that scope, I would have to say it wasn't a great winner. Right. And that's partly because of, and we can go on looking at some of the chains of requirements and the way they tend to build as they come down the pyramid. And by the time they hit the bottom, they've got very big. And there's risk because everybody's covering their arse and putting a bit more on it. And then the other is about the immediate impact, the air quality, particularly from air and noise quality. Noise is less of a drama these days because most sets will be reasonably tolerable, partly driven by the basic legislation. And if you're sensible where you put them, they're not usually too horrendous. Emissions is an issue, and we spent a lot of money at the Olympics particle filtering a lot of the sets that went into central London, in particular, where you've got a diesel particulate issue. So from that point of view, it did pretty well. Now we're trying to see if we can persuade someone else to spend the money to rent particle filters, and that's where you keep bashing into that question. I think a classic example, and I can give you one example from the Olympics that was particularly galling to have to be on the receiving end, and this is where we come down to the relationship. We're on the receiving end. Our requirement is to supply what they asked us to supply. Toilets, boring one. It's always the boring ones. Boring ones are the big numbers. There's one thing I have with the slight disagreement with some of Ben's measurements is his view that stage lighting is the biggest user on the festival. It's not. It's all the boring shit. It's lots and lots of little boring things chugging away. Toilets. Toilet supply decided they would supply toilets with 12 kilowatt flash electric heating in them. And their argument was that this is more economical than having a 2 kilowatt little immersion heater in a pot going all day, because it's only used when somebody actually hits the tap that this thing kicks in. Now, on a main supply, that's probably true and lightly used. The problem it gives you is that when you put 20 toilets in a bank, now you've got a lot of kilowatts of water heating there. Then you have a man from environmental health that says, well, hot water must be available. If there's no hot water, we'll shut you down. So it becomes an event critical supply that hot water is available. So suddenly we've now got a huge bank of stuff that might just in some circumstances be used by everybody all at once, particularly if you've got a game with a half time or something, and it did happen. Something like hockey was like that, and go from nothing to wham and back off again. And everybody rushes out in the interval and comes back again. So you start to build this pyramid now. So now we've got this big supply that's been deemed now event critical. So it needs to be backed up, because all event critical supplies by policy, the Olympics are backed up, so the Olympics can carry on. While the bomb goes off around outside us and the smoking ruins of the city, you can still, watch the ping pong safely and wash your hands with warm water. So it's all good. So this then builds to this thing, and then you put big lumps of them around, and then you stick them, because they're nasty smelly things, so you stick them a bit away from all the nice stuff, because you wouldn't want, if people do a war, you don't really want them right behind the stand, a bit nasty. So now you put them the other side of the access road and all that. So suddenly they become an island. So now you've got a potentially large power island that needs redundant running power and probably ends up doing very little, because actually everybody goes in, gives it a quick waggle under the coal tap and runs out again. So you've got this enormous capacity sat there chugging away, doing very little, but none of that has been of the making. Flagged at the beginning, it said, it's horrid, don't let them do it. They go, no, the purchasing's done a deal with the cabin company, that's what we're getting. Right, that wasn't a good move, was it? We think we got a good price. Oh, okay. You haven't seen the rest of it. And so it builds up. So you've got this. It's a very difficult one. You're sort of the villain of the piece. There's two 500 kVAs thundering away, smoking like chimneys, desperately poor things doing absolutely nothing. And everyone goes, why did you put all that in there? And you said, well, we did offer them the choice to have, 5 200 kVAs on a power management thing, so they'd come on and off as the load came on. They said they didn't have enough ground to put them in, or they didn't want to pay the cost because it was slightly more expensive to have the little ones and all the electronics to drive it than to have two big ones. And that's where a lot of this comes from, and it is about breaking that chain, is how to get, I think, through it.
But surely if you presented the business case in terms of the potentially huge fuel savings from actually approaching that more efficiently, then the client's quid's in. And this has quite often been my argument. I mean, we've road
Not with that
tested a lot of the efficiency ideas that we've talked about in the guide at Shambhala, which I'm involved with. And we've saved money. We've reduced fuel consumption by 30% year on year. We've saved 30% of our total fuel bill. And we've actually reduced the cost of equipment and deliveries with that.
I think what you've got there is
just by specifying what we need. And we actually worked with our contractor, which is what we're all advocating. So we wrote it into the contract of our power provider to contact nearly everybody that was using power and say, and this is what you've been saying, Rob, to say what are you using, what you actually need. Because it's remarkable how even a trader who trades 12, 13 festivals through a season will just say, yeah, I need a 16 or a 32, because it's worked. It worked last year. Nobody actually adds up what they actually need.
Well, what's interesting, one example, Glastonbury's markets, where we directly charge the traders for the power they use, and we measure it, and we go and kick them if they're using too much, and we charge them more. Interestingly is actually the power requirement has come down quite noticeably in the years that's been, and that's, again, it's follow the money, that if you give them an actual hard incentive, that will happen. It's about making that incentive, it's squaring the different things, making that incentive sufficiently hard, like the US fiscal cliff or something, for it. It's making it sufficient to be worth the fuss, because it is fuss. It's all about fuss. This inefficiency mostly stems from convenience and expediency. It's just easier, safer from the point of view of the thing will happen, and more convenient to do it a lot of ways than it is to try and
You also touched on something that we've talked about before, which is, which I always say, which is you always start in the boring areas anyway. The best way to start is in the boring areas, where the toilets are, where the site lighting is, where the backstage offices are, and you try and make the efficiencies there, where it's less critical if it goes wrong. Which, I mean, if you do it right, it isn't going to go wrong anyway. But from the promoter's point of view, they can see that if the power goes out in an office for a bit, it's not the end of the world. If it goes out on the stage, you're knackered. So it's a really good place to prove these things and potentially prove some of the savings that Chris is talking about. And the savings will depend on the size of the event and the cost of the fuel at the time, because the cost of fuel goes up and down. But even if it's a small saving, if you can make a small monetary saving and be able to say you've saved X amount of carbon dioxide emissions and stick that on your website and say how green you are, that's a good, it's a good thing in itself, and it's also a good bit of publicity for you. And but it needs the promoters and the festival organisers. They do need to be gathering this information, and they do need help to do that.
Yeah. Which brings us neatly onto a monitoring device which is about to hit the market, which I'm very excited about. We should be doing a press release and launching the Powerful Thinking Monitoring Project in a couple of weeks, but essentially we're working with a partner to offer 10 festivals the opportunity to monitor themselves so they actually know what's going on. And it's the beginning of that process. We can't improve if we don't know where we're starting from. We need, and all of these conversations sort of centre on a lack of knowledge on the side of the festival organisers and production managers in terms of what improvements might be possible. So I think where we need to start as an industry is we need to start monitoring what we're doing. It's become entirely normal in the rest of society. The festival industry's actually been left behind. We've all got, many of us have got smart meters in our homes. Industry is on, we pay per kilowatt and have been for sort of decades. And when you'll probably all know someone that's got a smart meter if you haven't yourself, but as soon as you get an energy monitor in your home, you sort of take an interest in it, and people start getting kind of freakishly obsessed with kind of switching things off and watching how many kilowatts, and just being aware of your energy consumption just pushes you naturally towards using less. And that's what I'm hoping we can achieve at large in the festival industry, that we can start to culture more of an awareness and start to actually monitor what we're using, to identify where the opportunities are to save in future.
There's the grumpy old one in the corner. There is one key difference, which is that most festivals are not fed off an infinite grid or a near infinite grid. Now, that's an efficiency thing. I mean, the more that you designed a festival to run more from a central source with distributed power, the more you can take advantage of the efficiencies. It's the way the world works. The world works on a grid. And that's what the grid's trying to worry is as you work to a distributed grid, you've got this problem. So you get to the problem that your engine that's driving your thing will only do so much. Unfortunately, it's not very variable. This is where we move, your ears will prick up. This is where we move into the world of combining systems to try to get to even out that peak and trough. So you have to size for your peak. Now, there are ways to do that by using lots of small engines, chucking them, bringing them on and off. It works very well. It's very efficient, and we do. As Chris said, commercially we're doing that. We win contracts with factories and things because we offer them solutions like that, which will do that and cut their fuel bill significantly. They're usually at the expense of a slightly increased equipment rental and also space. And for a lot of events, actually space is what kills you. A lot of the Olympic stuff, strangely, space is what killed you. So surely they look at the savings. Didn't want to give up the ground. That was the killer in a lot of things. So you need to find a way to match that usage. You've got usage as a waste. Are you just leaving the taps running and the hot water heaters and all the lights on and that sort of thing? And you've got the fact that if you have an engine of a certain capacity chugging away, it becomes less efficient. It's not a huge gap, but there is a definite gap at the bottom. And once you drop into the very low percentages of its rating, it's burning fuel just to turn itself over and make a noise and generate some heat. That's what it's doing. And the load makes almost no difference. Then you get up onto its running curve, and it's what it is. It's a straight line. Pretty much the amount of power you use equates pretty accurately the amount of fuel you use. Down in the sort of kick at the bottom, you're mostly wasting it. And a lot of our engines spend a lot of time running like that, and it's not good for them. It's
not
terrible.
good for the engines. It's
It's
not.
not.
Increases the maintenance intervals. And so if you can turn that generator off when it's not really doing very much and have it turn on when it's required for a bit more, then you have not only the fuel savings, but you also then reduce the maintenance intervals and the cost of servicing of that generator set. So,
And this is the great step forward on them. And this is what we're trying we are trying to produce some of this stuff and use it. Tend to call it hybrids, like hybrid car. Same idea. It's battery storage, and it is ultimately it's this basic problem with the whole renewables world. It's how do you store that energy? It comes in, it comes and goes. Almost all renewables come and go, and they come and go at irritating times when you don't want the power. Solar's great in the day. It's not much use for running lights at night. Wind comes on cool, breezy days, and on hot, sultry days you hit the aircon, and the turbines are all stood still. So it's all about storage, and there is no good way to store electricity. There's no good way to store it. There are various ways. There are none that are as effective as a barrel of diesel in terms of energy density. Nothing like, by several orders of magnitude. And unfortunately, we're all stymied by this one brutal fact that when somebody finally cracks this brutal fact, life will get a lot easier. So we can work around. And on the small scale, it's easy to deal with it. You can either deal with not huge piles of relatively cheap batteries, or relatively small amounts of bargainingly expensive batteries. And on a small scale, they're both slightly eye-watering but tolerable.
very cost effective.
If you go into the very cost-effective, if you go into the big scale, you get into the hundreds of kilowatts. They just become so eye-wateringly expensive that unless you're NASA, honestly, they just aren't yet.
But if you're using them on what we're talking about,
But your cabin,
at the
your
scale,
guy in the
Your cabin,
cabin on his
your little-
laptop with
your
his
camera
lights
and
on,
your lights.
yeah,
and the
what
generator
we're
sitting
talking
there
about at the
idling.
moment is using them for the low base load when everything else is switched off. So when your stage is switched off, you still need your you still need a couple of work lights. You still need the PA system sometimes needs to be left on to prevent condensation forming in the electronics. If you're in your office, when your office is not being used very much, but it's still got things charging in it, laptops charging up, walkie-talkies charging up, that can all run off a battery bank because the power requirement for that is quite low, and your generator switches off. And when your generator's running during the day, even then it's not often running at its peak load, so it's got spare electricity, if you like, and it uses that to recharge the battery bank when it's switched on. So that's the main way to do it, is rather than looking at having to have 100 kilowatts of batteries to run everything.
Yeah, and the technologies are there to do it, and it is happening already. Festivals are embracing that and working with these technologies. We've done it with big and small festivals, but it's actually the challenges around implementation and how it's financed. I think that's one of the biggest challenges
Back to the money.
for the big promoters, which both of our companies work with.
Even
It's a
big
challenge
festivals
around there
operate
is a cost.
in the same way on site as small festivals. Everything is compartmentalising. So you, on a temporary power arrangement, you don't generally have a big grid that you set, a big distribution grid you set up that feeds the entire site from one or two generators, or from a generator park. I mean, you do it a bit, that's really on the markets, but that involves investing quite a lot in infrastructure, so a lot of people aren't prepared to do that.
It also means it's also an area where we don't have quite the egos.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the big drivers, huge driver of wastage on a lot of event sites is the I must have my own supply
Yeah.
mentality. And that mitigates against the whole idea of creating an efficient
But it does
supply
help
and anticipating.
with the hybrid thing, ironically, because if each little area has its own generator, then you're not trying to provide lots of power. You're providing a discrete amount of power, and then when the power demand drops, the generator cuts out, and you go to your hybrid solution.
An aside, but the windmills on a wind farm, true or false that they tick over with red diesel?
Well, they tick over on power.
Right.
They turn them.
Yeah.
You turn them. An alternator is a motor and vice versa,
Yeah.
depending on how you excite it. So they spin because you don't want them just hitting. So usually you'll see them just if they're on a stark, calm day, you're seeing them idling over.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pulling
They're coming from the
a few,
grid.
few tens of
Pulling-
kilowatts to
pulling
take themselves over.
electricity.
Then as the wind blows against them, slowly they try to speed up against that.
So, they'll
it's
be running on whatever the nearest power station is running on the grid.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I prefer to focus on the fact that the research that we did with De Montfort last year, we looked at 8 different festivals just to get a snapshot of what was happening, what was normal at a festival, how are people managing their power. And we found generators that were 7 times the size they actually needed to be. We found that it's actually normal for generators to be running at, say, 25% of their capacity. It's below.
That's
so
where the
it's-
biggest net benefit savings.
Our challenge is, as an industry, that we're not as efficient as we can be, that we can take some simple steps to improve that. We've published a guide, which is a starting point both for advice for festival organisers and to open up this conversation at industry level. And savings are very achievable. Using renewables cost effectively is becoming more achievable. I'd just like to redirect that back from the kind of
fantasy world,
Sorry to interrupt, guys. We're going to go to questions now because we're run over already, but it'd be good for people to have a chance to ask if there's anything.
Yeah, Paul Fleming from De Montfort University in Leicester. As Chris just said, over the past 4 years we've been monitoring electricity consumption at about 18 events and about 70 different things. And what we're showing is that there's a really big opportunity in 2 ways. Firstly, to use things more energy efficiently, specify things to reduce the electricity demand, then switching things off, and then identifying those loads that could be met by solar and things. And basically, if you've got that information that Chris is talking about gathering over the next year or so, you can then go back to your power providers and negotiate better contracts and better understand what's going on. And in the future, I think we'd be looking at smart grids at outdoor events where you've got smart meters, you've got information, you've got traders, and you've got production areas that understand what electricity they consume and can take action to reduce it. So there's some feedback mechanism there as well. So I think it's quite positive, really. Things have happened recently, and I think it could be a real positive thing in the future years.
Any more questions? I've got a couple of questions actually. One of them is, with the powerful thinkers, is it possible to create some kind of a template that organisers can use to give to the people that need power from them? Because a lot of organisers don't understand how to gather that information. If there was a simple format that everybody could use, with a little bit of explanation about what the different things mean, is that a feasible thing to do, and is it something that we could create as a group to distribute?
Yeah, I mean, Bill, if you want to get in on this one after me, but it's a very simple thing. Yeah, I think it's just a list of what they intend to use.
We already have a list, a just an Excel spreadsheet that we send out when we're doing a power contract. We'll send that out and say list the consumers, you know, or you know, in the case of stages and other things, send us your full technical specifications, and then just kind of experience. You start to get a feel for exactly what the real life draw is. So it's worth noting that the back of box rating isn't necessarily always what the real draw is as well. In fact, quite often it isn't. But yeah, I mean, in terms of a simple resource, if people want a spreadsheet that says what questions do I need to ask, then yeah, please feel free to contact me and I'll share the template that we use with you.
And this is already normal when using renewables at festivals, because there's the necessity to specify it much more accurately. So.
I think it's also the whole gist of it all runs around risk and who wants to take it. It's quite difficult to accurately predict what stuff will pull unless it's a very simple load. Even very well organised shows will get it wrong by quite a long way. It's also variable, depends on what you do, depends how you use it. So there is a risk in trying to get that degree of efficiency. The closer you get, the more the risk increases, and I'm not advocating one tries to get to very, very close because it will become too scary. There's certainly an element you can go down on it, but it is quite hard. It's quite hard. You can ask people, but it's an awful lot of people don't really know, and that's part of the problem. And it's not always that easy to say. If I look at opening ceremony on the Olympics, it ran at about a quarter-ish. Well, it's just a third of probably what it was designed to be able to cope with. And that was put together by a lot of people who know the stuff very well, indeed.
But
And it's based on and it starts with lists of stuff, and I can show you all the spreadsheets showing exactly how many of this sort of lamp they're putting up, which is exactly what they put up. Right. And yet, when you aggregate it all and bring it all together, actually it's out by quite a large margin, a margin that would not be considered, in many fields, an acceptable margin. So it isn't a trivial task, but certainly, for me, one of the biggest single things, particularly at the smaller scale, and it all builds from a small scale, is the simple one about the plug size. It just isn't necessarily something that goes for a 13 amp plug, it goes for a 125 inlet, it goes for that old board you had with the big power locks on from the good old days when life was real rock and roll. You know what you're doing, and now you've got a couple of Twitchy lights and some LEDs, but you haven't actually changed the main box.
Would you agree that it might be easier to specify those things for the more boring bits? So the power that's run in office is the power that's run by traders. You can predict that slightly better.
You can predict it slightly better for more domestic loads because they're easier to define. There's also operation. It's how you operate things, and that's part of it. Is how do you let everybody say I want to be able to do everything all at once because I just must? Or do you say no, you just mustn't, and you can turn that lot on, you can turn that lot on 10 minutes later. If you turn it all on one fuse blows, I'm kicking you because I told you that's how it's going to work. And that's about taking ownership of that stuff, because a lot of that is we tend to be on. I always feel we're very much on the receiving end of that tree, and that tree has a lot of people in it doing their own thing. And if you want to be serious about it, if you want to run your festival on renewables, it's doable. But you have to start from the top down and say that's the game. That's the game you're coming into. Don't tell me you want a helicopter and 400 power cans for your act, because you're in the wrong festival, chap. And if you're prepared to say that, then you can move it that way around. If you're working the other way around and it's yes, we've got the rider, then you're always going to be inevitably running inefficiently. I think that's the mindset that has to sort of shift a bit.
Chris, with your guide, what's the take-up been like on that? What's its objective, and how busy has it been with people? I take it as a download thing.
Yeah, it's aimed at festival organisers, and it provides a background in different types of power, a crash course in power, really. Oh, is it on here?
Yeah, if you scan this, you can get
Ooh. There you go. Scan the. Very slick.
Can't get the PowerPoint.
Scan the back, and it's a free download. But essentially, there's several parts to it. There's a crash course in temporary power, just to increase awareness about the different types of technologies, how they work, and what they can be used for. And then there's a discussion of the issues, kind of where we're at as an industry, what the issues and opportunities. And then there's a guide section, which is things that we could do as festival organisers to run our festivals more efficiently.
And what sort of response have you got to that? I mean, are people actively downloading it and getting involved?
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of downloads. We're still promoting. We're doing the rounds at industry events.
As one of the list of suppliers that's featured in that guide, I've had people contact me independently as a result of downloading and the publicity around
Okay,
it. So
that's
it is
good.
reaching people
Yeah.
that I have hadn't heard of the event or the organiser that contacted me at a trade show recently and said, I've just downloaded the guide and I want to talk to you about this. Here's my site plan, what can we do? So I think it is making an impact and hopefully that will continue to increase.
But I think it's the beginning of a relatively long process. It's
Yeah.
gonna take a few years for this shift to happen at industry scale, but it has begun.
You need the big companies to make the investment ultimately, don't you, to have the kit that can do the job. I mean,
Two aspects: you need to have the kit, your job, and you need to get confidence. As I said, we come back to the original point. It's all about fear, and that will take time to build.
I think that's a good point to close on. And thank you guys, that's so much really brilliant information. Round of applause for the panel. And we've got teas and coffees next door now in the Victoria Suite, and then we'll be back in here to start the next panel at 12:10.
How interesting is the audience?